What say you to a kingdom bought by gold and sold by cruelty? In a market where horses are numbered like coin, a great man, whose coat is midnight and whose purse is a small sun, casts aside a creature as if it were a broken goblet. And in that throwing a silence falls heavy as winter. Hear the hoof that drags no music, the wind that carries a bitter iron scent, the hush of men who know the price of splendor but not the cost of mercy. A poor maid, threadbare of gown but rich in a tenderness she scarcely understands, pauses mid-step. She holds a silver strand wound about her wrist, a thing stolen from grief and kept as promise. Her hands are honest. They have mended bridles and bound light wounds and coaxed the last twitch from an old mare who thought herself too tired to rise. She looks upon the tossed beast, its rib cage a map of neglect, a scar like an old oath across its shoulder, and asks the only question left to one who still believes in souls. Who will hear him breathe? Thus begins the choice. Will gold decide his fate, or will a heart too poor to possess law lift him from the gutter? Who shall speak for the horse? Who shall answer wrong with mercy and right with ruin? In the town the river took all names and the wind took none. Autumn lay about the roofs like a prayer. Markets pulsed at dawn, bakers with hands white as paint, coppersmiths whose hammers counted the hours, lads who gambled on sparrows, and through it all moved Mara, small as a whisper, with eyes that kept the color of wet earth. She tended to what others scorned, the tack rooms, the horses no longer fit for race or show, the aching legs and the dull eyes no man called worth his salt. Her life was stitched of tiny mercies, a slice of bread traded for a rawhide bridle, an hour's labor for a bowl of oat and the shelter of a lean-to. She lived by the ledger of needs, her father's debt, the landlord's patience, the promise she'd made every night to the portrait in a locket she had never opened. That locket, thin and silver, lay hidden at the bottom of her bundle. She touched it as one touches a sleeping thing, for fear its waking might demand more than she could pay. Mara's ordinary day began in the gray that precedes dawn, when horses dream in low wickers and the stable smells of steam and cut hay. She moved with the animals as if conversing in a language the town had forgotten, soft humming, the small coaxing of palms, the steady weight of presence. She knew that a horse will tell you what doctors might not, a twitch of the ear, a grinding of the jaw, the way a foreleg bears less than it should. From her hands streamed patience, not pity, and patience, she had learned, mended more than medicine. Across the square, on higher stone and under a canopy stitched with gold trim, stood the mansion of Master Hallworth, his title puffed by coin and hunger. He kept his stables for show, black coats that shone like lacquer, bloodlines written in contracts, names feathered in the mouths of racing men. He paid for the town's silence as one pays a toll, and he held the power to make a beast into a legend, or to grind it beneath boots without complaint. People bowed to him for bread, not for love. In his pocket lay a ledger larger than Mara's, and in that ledger lay the accounts of men and beasts and the quiet ledger of debts unspoken. Mara knew the shape of Hallworth's crest, a rearing mare encircled by a sun, a motif embroidered on ribbons, stamped upon the harness of his favorites, and carved upon a small wooden token her father once kept. Her father, a groom of honest name, had worked once within Hallworth's high stable. Mara grew with stories of a charger that had raced as if the wind were a lover. When he died, this she never said aloud. Their little house learned the language of closing doors. The silver strand on Mara's wrist was all that remained tangible of fatherly warmth. It was braided from a scrap of ribbon and a single silver thread he had slipped into her palm the night he was feverish, and spoke of horses like poets speak of women. There was a wound behind Mara's steady hand, but she bore it as one bears weather, assumed, enduring. People guessed it was poverty. Some guessed it was folly. Neither guessed how tender courage can be when one has nothing left but the habit of mercy. She entered Hallworth's shadow only as business required, selling a horse's shoe here, taking a mend there, never to plead, never to kneel. Her pride was the quiet kind that keeps a hearth lit. Yet beneath that modest steadiness lay the seed of a wish, that a single life might be kept whole not by contract but by care. When market day arrived and men brought forth their goods like offerings, bread, cloth, the polished teeth of commerce, so too came a box. It had no gilding. It smelled of tar and old iron. Men cleared a space and set upon it a creature. The horse that was brought forth was no noble specimen. Ribs spoke of hunger. A foreleg hung as if tethered by some secret rope, and a scar ran across the shoulder like a reprimand. Its eyes were quiet. An ocean glassed over, and its breath came slow as if remembering another sky. The chain round its neck did not clang. It dragged like a lost hymn. Halworth's men stood by, their hands clean. Halworth himself stood apart, a figure cut in midnight, his voice a coin. "Fetch the waste," he said. "There is no sport in sorrow." His servants showed the paper, a fine beast no longer fit to raise a profit. The crowd shuffled. Coins chimed. And against all this, Mara stood small and trembling, her hand upon a small cloth bag of saved pennies. She acted with no flourish, no proclamation. Where others saw ruin, she saw an instrument of fate misplayed. She stepped forward, voice thin but steady, and offered what little she had, an exchange of labor, a plea to tend the beast and show if its worth could be found beyond the cold lens of profit. Men laughed. Halworth's smile was a blade. He refused. He named the law of numbers and profit in business. He tossed the horse's chain as if it were a scrap, and the chain struck the cobble with a sound like a gavel. Mara did not leave that day. She did what the penniless do in the face of a storm. She waited for an opening, for a soft moment among the cruelty. When the crowd's hunger for spectacle faded and Halworth's men prepared to drag the animal away to the knacker's yard, Mara slipped close, small as a thought. She touched the horse's flank, and the creature, who had known only the language of men until now, lifted its head with the slow, suspicious grace of one who has been betrayed. Their eyes met, a human eye fissured with worry, and a horse's eye, round and honest and lately learned in sorrow. In that look there was no title, no coin, no ledger, only recognition. Mara felt something leap up inside her that had been caged these many years. The belief that being poor does not make one blind to dignity. She spoke then, in a whisper, meant for animals and old ghosts. "Stay," she said. "If thou wilt bear my hands, I will bear thee." He answered by breathing, a sound like a bell muffled in wool. That breath, small, fragile, seemed to say more than Halworth's laws. Mara's heart hammered like an oaken mallet upon a stave. She traced the scar with fingers that smelled of oats and soap. There, beneath the cruel light, a blackened branding marked the horse's flank. A curve and a sun like Halworth's crest, yet not his heraldry. As if the mark had been burned by someone's careless pride, Mara recoiled. Her silver thread prickled against her wrist. The mark stirred a memory so deep she could not name it. And the crowd, which had decided the creature's fate with a glance, murmured and moved away. Halworth, watching, folded his hands and smiled as one folds a sail. "Keep it if thou must," he said to his men, and then softer, "But know this, such beasts purchase only grief." He turned and left, his cloak a moving shadow. The men began to haul the horse towards the wagons. Mara, poor as the dregs of a coin, made a choice men called mad. She stepped between the chain and the cart and the men. She named her price not in coin but in promise. Nights of tending, mending, pain endured, and, if need be, a body on the line. The men laughed. One lifted a hand to shove her aside. She did not flinch. He who had been called Rook by those who tended him, so. Mara later learned the shape of name in hoof and breath, had been placed under a coarse halter whose leather had been chewed at the seams. He shifted his weight to the hind, testing the limb with an intelligence rooted in survival and memory. When Mara stepped close, he flinched from the hand of man, not from her. He let her come because she smelled of oats and gentle hands. He allowed the touch because she spoke the old lullaby of her father, a soft two-note phrase that sounded like rain in dry ears. She worked then the way those who have nothing but time and love work. She boiled herbs in a pot, poulticed the wound with warm bran, and stitched torn skin with the awkward competence of someone who has mended saddles beneath moonlight. Each stitch was a promise. Word spread as words do in a town that loves an easy story. A whisper became a rumor. The poor girl who would not let the rich man's beast be hauled to death. Men came to gawk. One called her folly, another called her saint. Halworth's overseer, a man named Crane, watched from the edge with a patience like a trap. He kept a ledger of his own, not of coin, but of leverage. "That beast," he said one day, "is worth more in silence than in life." He hinted of a race, of wagers lost, and the necessity of disposing of bad stock. Mara's hands trembled at the words she did not fully understand. She understood. There were forces wishing the horse dead for reasons that were not mercy. Days passed and the horse's breath came steadier. He learned to shift weight, to trust a touch that did not strike. He would press his forehead into Mara's palm as if anchoring himself to a shore. He ate with a patience wrenched from hunger. He watched the town with one eye that calculated danger and another that counted trust. But trust in him was like glass, thin, fragile, easily shattered. At nights, Mara sat by his flank and hummed the lullaby until sleep took them both. The horse would sometimes nudge the locket that lay inside Mara's pocket, as though drawn by metal to memory. Once he pawed at that pocket and drew out, not the locket, but a small wooden token with a rearing mare carved upon it, half burned, half smooth from handling. Mara's fingers closed upon it as if it were a key. Her father's story stirred like embers. A rival emerged, the stable hand Bram, whose hands were quick and whose loyalty was sold to the highest whisper. Bram had once hoped to rise in Hallworth's favor. Now he saw in Mara's devotion a way to climb. He coveted the animal for reasons tangled with his own debts and darker ambitions. He began to shadow Mara's steps, to watch when she left the horse in an old granary behind her cottage, to sneak near the yard and judge the animal's worth. Bram's eye was business, his smile a trap. He gathered a small knot of men who liked to test luck against the town's misfortunes. "Think," Bram said to them once, "what a horse like that could fetch if mended and sold under cover." They pictured coin and warmth and doors opening, things they had not seen in many winters. Mara began to fear men more than she feared poverty. She feared the law of coin that could name a life worthless. Yet she feared more the thought of the horse's spirit beaten out, not through need but through cunning. She tightened the rope about his halter, brought him into the loft at night where the rafters kept watch, and lay upon straw to guard him. She learned to read his breaths. A clench in the flank told of a hidden pain, a nod of the head told of remembered kindness. He would sleep and dream. Sometimes he would twitch and neigh softly, as if running past an old fence. Once in a fevered dream he kicked and thrashed, and Mara, waking, saw upon his flank a pattern of scars that made her blood run cold. A mark not of the field, but of something done in anger, an emblem branded not as ownership, but as message. She wrapped him and prayed she could read the message aright. Winter tightened its fingers. The town grew thinned of charity. Hallworth's men increased their rounds. Crane, the overseer, began to make inquiries that smelled of law. Missing beasts reported, inquiries to the magistrate, talk of auctions. Mara's small victories, one more oat, one less limp, were measured against a looming loss. She bartered for herbal salves and traded away the last of her silver thread to a jeweler, who had been kinder to her father. At night she would sleep with the wooden token beneath her cheek and dream of a son and a mare, of Hallworth's laughter, of a stable full of shining beasts. In those dreams she saw her father younger, his hands clean, and heard him say, "Choose the life that must be given, child. Choose thy hands." Then one stormed evening, when rain lashed like strings upon the town and the river mouthed at its banks, Bram and his men came to the granary. They moved silent as shadows, their boots eating the straw soundlessly. Mara, below in a fever of stitching, smelled them before she saw them. The sourness of rope, the stale beer of men who gamble with other people's bones. She crawled to the loft and peered through a crack in the slats. There they were, Bram with a lantern, Crane behind him with a tall staff, and two others with hands like claws. The horse shifted in the dark, flared his nostrils, and in that light Mara saw, clear as a brand upon flesh, the crest she had once seen upon Hallworth's ribbons, the rearing mare and the sun, carved cruelly upon the horse's flank. Her breath stopped. The token in her pocket warmed like a heart. If the mark was what her memory feared, then this animal was not merely a castaway. He was a signpost in a story she had been taught as a child, and refused to listen to because it hurt. The tale of a missing charger, of debts that ran like blood, of a stable once scandalous. She had a choice: hide the beast and risk the wrath of men who had power, or reveal him and watch as coin swallowed mercy. Her hands shook. She felt the weight of her father's hand in hers, whether it was memory or wish she could not know. She breathed the lullaby once, twice, and then louder. The horse answered with a low nicker that sounded like a pledge. Bram's men waited for the right moment. They were patient. Moses, the watchman, had been bribed elsewhere. The storm covered sin like a cloak. Mara felt she was at the edge of a precipice. She could not, would not let them seize him. A wildness rose in her. the sort that comes when one has been pushed and finds at last the courage that has been stored like coals. She slid down from the loft, rolled through the mud, and put herself between the men and the horse. Bram laughed, and Crane called for law and order. Then, with a movement swift as a blade, Bram seized the halter. The horse recoiled, and in that instant a voice, one she had heard once years prior in the hush of a fevered night, cut across the storm. "Stop." It was Halworth's voice, distant but present, as if the town itself had made him walk. Men froze. The lantern swung, and then Halworth appeared, cloak-soaked, eyes cold as river ice. He looked upon the horse, then upon Mara, and something like recognition passed across his face. An acknowledgement not of the animal's worth, but of the trouble such an animal heralded. "Take it," he said to Bram. "If thou wishest coin, claim it. But mark this, anyone found sheltering that beast shall answer to me." Bram grinned. Crane folded his arms. The town held its breath as the river held a leaf. Mara felt the world narrow to a pinprick. Halworth's words were not a threat, but a promise of ruin. Yet within her something had quietly uncoiled. She would not cower. If the horse bore Halworth's crest, then the beast carried in its flesh a memory that might undo more than Halworth intended. Mara understood then, with a clarity that disarmed fear, that her act to save a single life might tug at the thread of a larger tapestry, one that braided her past and Halworth's secrets into a perilous knot. She seized the halter with hands that would neither tremble nor slacken. The horse, who had been half broken by pain and wholly broken by loss, leaned into her palm as if choosing. The loft door banged open. Bram reached out, fingers closing on leather. The storm screamed its approval, and then Mara saw it. The brand, not merely an emblem, but a name burned into flesh by a hand that had looked upon it as verdict. She staggered back. The wooden token in her fist fell to the straw. She picked it up, and the carving on the token matched the brand with a cruelty that tasted of iron. Her knees went weak. For a breath she saw her father, young and whole, standing in a stable where the air smelled of polish and oats. She saw Halworth smiling at something he had bought and something he had lost. The revelation struck like a hammer. This was no common animal. This was Halworth's lost charger. The one disappeared the year her father left work with a wound unspoken. She mouthed the name she had never dared to hope. Rook? Pale Moon? The town had called the steed many things. The horse stamped, and in the blow of straw and rain a messenger came, one of Halworth's men, breathless, with a paper that bore the seal of a magistrate. Bram's hand tightened. Crane's jaw set. Mara felt the world shift beneath her like a poorly laid stone. "What will you do?" Bram hissed. She did not answer with words. She answered with a choice that was not reversible. She reached into her pocket and drew forth the silver strand, the only coin of memory she had, and wrapped it about the horse's mane like a talisman. The horses in the loft drew close, as if at the touch of fire, and the animal leaned his head upon her shoulder. For a single suspended heartbeat, the mill and the river and the storm seemed to listen. Outside, Halworth's carriage coughed like a beast about to wake. Inside the granary, the horse breathed heavy, and the wooden token matched the brand beneath the ragged light. Then Crane stepped forward and spoke 3 words that would split Mara's life from the life she had known. "We make claim." And with that claim, the simple saving of a single creature ceased to be a small mercy and became a summons. The town's lane thinned of ordinary nights. The storm did not soften. It heralded more. Mara's hand tightened on the halter until her knuckles shone like bone. She would not let go. But Halworth had not come without measure. Outside the granary, upon the muddy ground, 2 men knelt beside a paper sealed with wax. Words thereon named theft. Words thereon named compensation. Words thereon named consequences that would demand more than oaths. Mara looked at the brand, at the token, at the thread around her wrist, and understood that mercy had the power to widen into a storm. The choice she had made was no longer merely for a horse. It had become a challenge to a man who had never been denied. She closed her eyes for a breath, feeling the breath of Rook against her cheek, and opened them to meet Halworth's gaze through the crack of the door. "Who speaks for a beast that speaks no coin?" Halworth asked, and the granary answered only with the sound of the horse's slow, steady breathing. Bram's shadow fell across the threshold. Crane's hand hovered near the magistrate's seal. Outside, the storm sharpened to a howl. Mara pulled the halter close to her chest like a child drawing a blanket. "I do," she said. And the town, tightened by fear and curiosity, waited to see if a single poor hand could withstand the weight of a rich man's law. The market that morning was a throat of murmurs. The magistrate's chair sat like a small stern moon above the press. Halworth arrived in a carriage whose wheels cut through mud like a tongue through cloth. His cloak sodden kept a shape of command. He brought with him paper sealed in wax, 2 men in sober coats, and the small thin smile of those who think law is the same as right. Bram stood near, a hawk that fancied himself king in another's shadow. Crane, folded and patient, held the magistrate's seal as if it were a weapon that could be leveled at any singing heart. All the town had come, the bakers with flour on their breath, the stable boys with hands not yet hardened to cruelty, women whose skirts knew the weather of worry. Because a living thing had been named and a poor woman had said no, Mara came into the light with the horse at her side. Rook walked with a deliberate care, ears pricked like little flags for warning and curiosity. His nostrils flared at the scent of so many strangers. His flank bore the memory of chains and the shape of the brand that burned like a dark sun. He kept his weight shifted, testing the ground as if learning the town anew. Mara's hand lay at the seam of his mane, fingers white from holding until pain is no longer noticed. Around her wrist, the silver thread, now knotted and stained, caught the dawn. In her other pocket, the wooden token warmed like a secret. The magistrate read the summons as if his voice might stitch closed a wound. This beast is claimed by Master Halworth as his property. Theft is alleged. Those sheltering shall render property or answer for theft. There were sounds, the clink of coin, the cough of indignation, the small breath of disbelief. Mara stepped forward. Her voice at first was thin as a reed, then gathered like a river. She told, not with accusation but with remembering, what had been done in a stable years ago. She spoke of her father's honest hands, of the night he left employment for reasons she had feared to name. She laid the wooden token upon the magistrate's knee, and the carved mare thereupon seemed as if it breathed again. Halworth's face tightened as if a thumb had been pressed across a soft place. Recognition is a sudden cold. He peered, then paled, then laughed like someone who fears the breaking of glass. A child's trinket, he said. Coin does not hide a theft. Bram stepped forward and told a story shaped with eagerness, how the horse had been found wandering, and how Halworth's men had marked the beast to spare confusion. Crane nodded, for the comfort of an established lie is the nod of common counsel. Rook's ears flicked. He moved forward a step and the crowd hushed like a river held by ice. Mara did not plead to the magistrate for pity. She produced instead the locket she had never opened, the one she had kept as if one keeps a small graveyard in the pocket. The locket's clasp, rusty with time, fell open in her hand, and within lay a folded scrap of paper, her father's handwriting in a scrawl like an apology. The script named days, not coin. It named Halworth's stallion a proud beast called Silver Sun, and a debt made in haste to hide a foolishness. It spoke of a night when voices had argued among the stalls, when men had chosen theft as the balm for vanity, and of a man who had taken a charger, branded another to confuse the mark, and sent a groom away with shame sewn to his coat. Mara's breath trembled. The paper trembled. The crowd leaned close as if to hear what ink might confess. Halworth did not deny. He hardened. Fables, he said, and his voice was the slide of a scythe. Yet in the sudden slack of his claim there was a crack. Rook, who had known the scent of that stable, the scrape of iron, the hush of Halworth's voice in the dark, stepped nearer and placed his muzzle against Mara's open palm, then lifted his head and turned slowly to Halworth. The act was simple, a horse turning his face towards a man. But in that movement 1,000 small memories congealed. Late oats, the press of a velvet boot, the burn of iron. The beast's nostrils flared in recognition. He whinnied once, low and clear, a sound like metal struck and memory answering. The whinny lodged in the marrow of Halworth's pride. Men in the crowd shifted. Something like a current passed through them. Halworth's posture faltered. His eyes, which had worn arrogance like a cloak, darted to the wooden token, to the locket, then to the brand upon Rook's flank. A hand, not wholly his, trembled at the edge of his sleeve. Bram stepped forward with intention to claim the animal, to wrench it free by muscle and contract. But Halworth raised his hand and, for the first time that day, found his voice small. This beast has served me once, he admitted, and the words fell like fallen coins. He was mine. Yet the world takes names as if water takes color. If this has been true, if there was deceit, then let the law decide. The magistrate, who had been fattened on paper more than truth, called for witnesses. Bram, greedy for the acclaim that might accompany a clever theft, took breath and named men who had seen a beast sold in a back lane, a groom paid to keep quiet. Crane, who had feared for his margin, spoke on Hallworth's behalf in half-pleas. The magistrate's clerk read older records, receipts, bills, a small note that proved a horse of Hallworth's color had been insured the year Mara's father left. Papers pressed like weights upon conscience. Then, as if the town needed a hammer to break the case, a man stepped forward from the crowd, an old groom with a face like creased leather, a man who had once worked for Hallworth and had seen more stables than he could name. He had been no friend of Mara's family. His life sat in the shadow of nights spent with horses. His voice cracked like a reed when he spoke, but it carried. "I was there," he said. "I saw them brand, to hide, to fool. I helped, because I feared hunger more than shame." The confession was a mirror thrust between Hallworth and his court. Gasps followed like clapping of distant thunder. Hallworth's face went through a sequence of colors, white, then the ash-like flush of rage. He moved toward the old groom, words like knives in his mouth. "You lie!" He struck the air with accusation. But the old groom only stared and shivered and said, "I would have told before, but fear keeps men mute. I tell now for the horse's sake, and because a child kept a token that proved what my memory feared." The magistrate, who loved order, found his papers inadequate. Some in the crowd cried for immediate seizure, others for calm. Bram, deprived of improvised victory, showed his teeth. His envy turned to venom. In the press, a small boy called out the name of Mara's father, and then another voice. Bram's accomplice, drunk on the idea of profit, stumbled, and in that stumble, a truth uncloaked itself. He named names of men who had gained by deception and pointed, shaking, at Hallworth's door. The magistrate, caught between law and the roar of a crowd, declared a pause. An inquiry would happen, witnesses would be sworn, and Hallworth would be held to answer for the branding and for the attempted disposal. Men spoke the word arrest as if it were a bell. Hallworth's face failed. His smoothness cracked. In that space, Rook did something no law could have ordered and no man could have demanded. He knelt. With a slow, deliberate motion, the great beast folded his front legs to the earth, lowering his head until his forehead rested against Mara's chest. The gesture was old as loyalty and as sacred as oath. Horses kneel rarely, and when they do, it is to give themselves utterly. The crowd inhaled. The magistrate's clerk dropped his pen. Mara pressed her brow to the warm, damp crown of Rook's head and felt the tremor of the town in her bones. In that kneeling, there was a verdict the law could not easily deny. A creature returning to the hand that loved him, and refusing the hand that had branded him for gain. Hallworth, undone by the spectacle, found his voice shrunk to a whisper and confessed. First in the tightness of anger, then in a quieter, thinner voice that confessed to foolish bargains, to branding to disguise, to selling away a charger in a moment when debts had been mountains. He named nothing noble. He named hunger and shame and the small corrosive selfishness that grows when one believes the world is only money. Bram and Crane sought to salve their names by blame, but their complicity was visible as rust on a nail. The magistrate, who loved precedence, heard the town's crackle and rendered an order. Hallworth would answer charges. The horse would be held in protective custody. Mara was to be recognized as a witness and caretaker until the inquiry concluded. When Hallworth was led from the square in the quiet shock of ruin, his cloak did not lift with the same regality as before. His steps were measured, for he had learned that power bears a cost. Rook raised his head and sniffed the air as if to know whether the wind had brought change. Mara felt the horse press his ribs against her side as if to say, "In a language not of men, thou didst well." The crowd dispersed in the slow manner of people relieved and chastened. The river outside the town swallowed its day's secrets and kept them for reflection. In that crucible of confession, the wheel of fate turned. And though the law would grind and take its time, the seed of truth was planted, watered by a poor woman's faith and by a horse that chose to kneel. The inquiry took days that moved like winter, each long and patient. Witnesses were called. Receipts were read. Old ledgers, once thought dull, became small altars of truth. The magistrate, obliged by both law and the sudden public will, summoned those who had profited. Bram's accomplices, shamed by the old groom's testimony and by bites of their own conscience, named names they had been paid to hide. Crane, who had feared for Halworth's favor more than for justice, was compelled by papers that proved complicity. He surrendered titles to small parcels of land to avoid harsher ruin. Halworth, confronted with the arithmetic of his bargains, pleaded for mercy with a voice that had never been trained to ask for anything but more. Mara visited Rook each day. She brought balms and bran and a blanket stitched from 2 other shawls she'd bought with hard-begged coins. The horse grew stronger. His coat, once dull as winter's stone, took on a sheen from the care and the sun. He flicked his ears when children came near, and he flared his nostrils at the scent of oats with a hunger that no longer tasted of despair. He learned to bear weight without wincing. He learned to trust a hand that had never struck. Mara, too, changed. Where before her life had been stitched of small mercies, now her days were measured by a new kind of duty. Legal visits, witness statements, the slow uncoiling of a town's guilt. Neighborhoods that had once bowed to Halworth's purse now nodded to the courage of a girl who chose to guard. There were debts to pay in ways that the town felt. Halworth's forfeited rights to the week's racing purse were used to fund a small fund for injured beasts. Names of those who had labored in darkness were cleared, and a stable was set aside for creatures declined by profit. Bram, who had imagined himself rising through cunning, found that small rises are often built upon quicksand. He was fined and forced into a season of public work. Crane, quieter now, took to cleaning the stables he had once kept for profit, his head bowed as he learned the heft of honesty. The old groom who had come forward found a modicum of peace. He took a post at the new public stable and taught poor boys the language of horses. Mara's locket remained closed until a night when she felt strong enough to bear whatever lay inside. She sat upon the loft's edge, Rook's breath fogging the cold air, and unfastened the clasp. Within lay a scrap of paper and a pressed clover, the little tokens of a father's hand. His writing, a map of love and fear, spoke not of riches but of this, that he had been made to sign away a beast he loved to cover a debt that was not his to pay. He had left for shame and fear, not because he loved the sea as Mara had once told herself to sleep. The locket's scrap did not bring the dead back. It brought context and the dull ache of a wound tended. Mara pressed the paper to her heart and felt, beneath the ache, a small flowering of clarity. Her father had been a man who loved horses. The town had only recently begun to see how love can be crushed by a man who mistakes coin for courage. Rook, whose healing had become a quiet public lesson, responded to Mara as only a creature that has been saved can. He followed her through the town's lanes, ears pricking at the sound of small children, nostrils catching the scent of bakeries. He led sometimes as if he had been chosen not only to carry weight, but to pull a town back from the edge. Once, when a frightened mare balked at the ferry by the river, Rook stepped close and nuzzled the foal, calming frayed nerves with the steadiness of his bulk. In those small moments, the work of saving a single horse became the work of saving a small part of the world that had grown callous. Mara found her place shifted, but not diminished. The new public stable, built by a combination of Halworth's penalties and communal donations, bore her name upon a small brass plaque that she never quite touched, for pride felt heavy and unnecessary. But the plaque brought people. Those who had once turned their backs now came to ask advice, to learn how to stitch a halter, to know the way a horse's ear betrayed worry. Mara taught them, not with sermon but with hands. The wooden token, sanded and preserved, hung beneath the stable rafters like a small shrine, yet not all wounds closed cleanly. Halworth lingered in town, his walk slower, his features drawn. He visited at odd hours to watch, perhaps hoping to find proof that the old order still stood. Instead, he saw little hands tending beasts that the market had once scorned. Something like shame sat upon him. Sometimes he left a coin at the stable door and would not look into the eyes of those he had wronged. The magistrate ordered restitution where possible, and Halworth's assets were used to aid those he had harmed, though no coin could buy back the nights of fear. The town learned, furnished with small victories, that justice could sometimes be slow, but that truth once sown finds a way to grow. In the soft hours of evenings when the market quieted and horses dreamed of pastures that might yet be, Mara would sit beside Rook and read aloud the scrap of paper from the locket, as if her voice could stitch time into something kinder. Rook would listen, ears turning like small sails, and at times he would press his warm nose against her hand as if to say, "I remember thee." At other times he would stare into the black river and imagine fields the way a man imagines a country he has never seen. all plains and green. Their bond, born of rescue, strengthened by shared scars, became the town's quiet legend. And somewhere in those days the wooden token found its payoff. An old ribbon, half-burned, turned up beneath Hallworth's tack room. An accident, some said, a slip of fate. The ribbon matched the token's carving, and the match sealed the small gaps of doubt that remained. Mara held the ribbon like a prayer and then tied it to Rook's bridle. The act was simple, its meaning vast. The horse shook his head and tossed the ribbon so that it fluttered like a small banner. Children laughed. Hallworth's face, watching from a distance, crumpled as if wind and truth had sanded down a proud cliff. Spring came cautiously, with the soft insistence of a horse nosing at a gate. The town, which had learned the measure of its own cruelty, walked lighter. The new stable hummed with the low music of animals well kept. Ropes were mended, oats measured, and a small library housed in a corner offered notes on care and gentle handling. Mara, who had once moved through life like a shadow that tends embers, found the shape of her days altered by responsibility and by a peace that had the depth of a well. Rook, now grown in strength and patience, carried himself with a dignity that was not for sale. On a morning when the fog still clung to the fields like unanswered questions, Mara led Rook to a hill outside town where grass grew long and the view opened to a river that had once swallowed names. She had the locket around her neck and the wooden token tied to the near stall of the bridle. Rook's ears flicked to the wind. His nostrils drank the scent of wildflowers. Mara placed her hand upon his flank, feeling the thrum of a heart that had been saved. In the valley below, men were raising the new stable's roof. Their laughter rose like small bells. Children waved, and Rook whickered low and warm. Mara thought then of the ledger of small mercies she had kept in her head for so long. Each stitch, each night tending, each time she had chosen another's life over her own comfort. She saw the arc of that ledger now bend toward something like flourishing. Her father's name was cleared in small print in the magistrate's book. His memory was no longer a folded secret, but a line in the town story. The wooden token, which had seemed only a relic of private grief, hung now in the stable's rafters as a small claim of truth. People spoke of Mara not as a charity, but as a teacher, and they came to learn from the woman whose hands had mended more than flesh. Rook shifted his weight and nudged the locket when Mara's fingers trembled. She unhooked it and held it to the light. The scrap of paper inside had faded but not been erased. The words thin and wise seemed now to belong to all who had loved and been burned by pride. Mara tightened the clasp and, with a smile that was not triumph but relief, slipped it back into place. She had kept a promise she had made in hunger and in fear. Now the promise itself was the town's prayer. As they turned to walk back through the lane, Rook's hooves kept a rhythm that matched Mara's breath. The horse led not as one who owned the road, but as one who had been entrusted with its passage. He thus became, by action not proclamation, the symbol he had been born to be. A living reminder that dignity cannot be bought, only defended. That scars, when tended, become maps to another life. Children ran ahead and called his name. An old groom doffed his cap. Mara looked at the faces gathered, at the small cluster of hands that now repaired what had been rent, and in that last light, when the town's roof shone like coins returned to their purse and the river reflected a softened sky, Mara understood something her father once hinted, in his fevered words, that saving one life starts a chain unseen, and the world in turn becomes kinder. She felt the weight of grief lessen, not gone but settled, shaped into a new purpose. Rook's breath warmed her cheek. His ear dimpled in a way that horses do when they are content. Above them, a lone hawk cut the air, and the town held its small success like a fragile fruit. Mara spoke then, softly, not to any law or ledger, but to that great animal who had knelt in the market and chose her hands. "We have done enough for now," she said. "We have kept one life. Let the rest learn." The horse snorted, a sound like release. And the last line, she thought, spoken in her heart more than loud, hung like a bell over the valley. "Where mercy keeps the hoof, there hope shall find its pasture." If thy soul was stirred by this telling and thy heart would keep such tales alive, subscribe and ring yon bell, that thou mayst join us anon for tales untold. Comment thy thought below. What wouldst thou have done in Mara's stead? And share this tale with one who loves the sound of hooves and the courage of the small. Join our company. Press the button, make word grow wings, and let mercy multiply.